All right, so ladies and gentlemen, the first thing I'm going to do is do a quick review of natural selection. So, Darwin, he wrote the book on the origin of species, and it had two main ideas. He mentions that the occurrence of evolution has a mechanism of natural selection. So, the central idea to Darwin's view of evolution is that there is descent with modification. All present day organisms are related to those of unknown ancestors in the past. Every generation has different variations. We saw this with the peppered moths, and we also saw that the traits are going to increase or decrease in frequency, which we also saw with the peppered moths. So we have to remember that there has to be some sort of variation. So for example, with the peppered moths, we had the dark moths and we had the light moths. So that was the variation. And in humans, we see a lot of different variations. We see, just looking around the classroom, you can see differences in hair color. You can see differences in eye color. There are differences in your vision. There are differences even in just the length of each of your fingers. There's lots and lots of variation for all the many traits that we have. And so Darwin observed this and he said, okay, individuals of a population are going to vary extensively. There's no two individuals that are exactly alike. So we can look at something like these ladybugs and we can see there's lots of different variations. Well, this variation we now know is inherited, that the different traits are passed down from one generation to the next generation. And so what happens is that living things are going to face a constant struggle. And this is called survival of the fittest. So what organisms do is they're going to produce more offspring than what are actually going to survive. And we saw this a lot back in the 1800s and 1900s, where people would have something like 15 children. And the whole reason that they had 15 children is because only, maybe 2 to 5 of them would survive to adulthood. And so what happens is those that actually survive, those 2 to 5 children that they had, were the ones that were able to survive the challenges of life better than others. And so those grew up and reproduced, and the most favorable characteristics accumulate over generations. And so there is a video on Schoology that kind of looks at how this works with insecticides and how certain variations survive the challenges and accumulate over generations. So when this video is over, you're individually going to go onto Schoology and you're going to watch this video on insecticide resistance to kind of reinforce what it is that I'm talking about in this process of natural selection. So natural selection, what you're going to see in that video is insecticide resistance. And so what we do is we develop insecticides that kill about 99% of the insects. And when we do this, there's usually a few survivors. And those few survivors resist the chemical attack that we give on them. Well, those that are able to survive and resist that chemical attack reproduce and they pass on their resistance. And so the next generation, we have an increase in these insecticide resistant organisms. So let's say 1% survived the beginning chemical that we applied to them. Well, that 1% reproduces, and let's say now we've got 1,000 more of them, and there's going to be a higher percentage that are resistant to the insecticide. So maybe this time it's 7% that survive and are resistant to that insecticide. And so what natural selection does is it's really acting on the variation, and it's going to edit the variation and the percentages that we see. And so we saw this with the peppered moth. With the peppered moth, we had 2 different variations. So we've got our variation here. And what happens is that those with the favorable trait are going to reproduce. So when they were light colored, we saw, maybe 75% of the moths were light colored moths and only 25% were dark colored moths. when we had a light forest. And then the Industrial Revolution occurred and we saw a change. And so what happens is a different trait increases in the population. And so in our data, we saw that now we had 75% were the dark moth, and now we only had 25% were the light colored moth. And so what we see here is a change. What happens is the gene frequency, how often we see a particular trait, is going to change when we have an environmental change from the light forest to the dark forest. Okay? And so we can look at evidence that supports this entire idea. And we've got 4 different pieces of evidence we're going to look at. We're going to look at the fossil record. We're going to look at the geographic distribution, so where organisms live and what types of organisms live in the different locations. We're going to look at what's called homologous body structures, and I'll teach you what those are. And then we're also going to look at similarities in their early development. Okay, so first is fossils. When we look at a family tree, we look at how similar the fossils are. And so fossils are going to be composed of the physical remains of an organism. So this image right here shows you the ancestors to the modern day African and Asian elephant. And you can see that there's all kinds of organisms that are now extinct that were very similar to today's elephants. And so we can look at that evidence and use that to kind of build a family tree. So what you're going to do after this video is done, there is a video on fossils that is by National Geographic that you're going to watch that gives you a little more detail about how fossils provide us that evidence for evolution. Next piece of evidence for evolution is the geographic distribution of living species. So this map right here, you can see there's a little key here that shows you all the locations that the beaver lives. This is what a beaver looks like. You can see that they look very similar to the muskrat. Well, the muskrat is living in locations only here and here. And then we see some more organisms that are similar, the capybara and the coypu. So these guys, they all are related to each other. We can see they're very similar, and they live in different areas. And so that indicates that in the past, they had common ancestors, common species that they descended from, and they now, this particular species is best adapted for the area that he lives in. The muskrat is best adapted. Sorry, the muskrat lives over here in these brown spots. The beaver lives in these blue areas. So they're best adapted to whichever area they live in. Another thing that we can look at is similarities in characteristics known as homology. So if we look at the structure of the human arm, the structure of a cat's arm, the structure of a whale's fin, and the structure of a bat's wing, what we see is they have the same skeletal elements. So what's really cool is that if you look at these images here, this bone right here that's colored orange, that's the same bone right here in the cat. That's the same bone right here in the whale. And that's the same bone right here in the bat. So these bones all have the same skeletal elements, but they have different functions to them. And so we call these homologous structures. So this is a vocabulary word that you want to learn. And understand that these bones that are very similar, they all diverged from the same ancestral 4-legged animal that walked around with 4 legs. Okay, so homologous body structures, we can see this again. Here's another image for you. And again, they're color coded. If we look at the toes of the turtle and the toe bones of the alligator and the ending bones of the wing of a bird and a mammal, we can see that these structures, They have different functions to them, but they have the same skeletal elements to them. Then we have vestigial structures. Now, these are quite interesting. We'll look at all kinds of different vestigial structures. What these are these are organs that have little to no importance in the current organism, but in the past they were important in the ancestors. So we'll look at some of these. These are some examples for you. And actually, it's been discovered now that the appendix is not considered a vestigial structure anymore. We've done some research and we found that it does still currently have some important functions. We formerly thought that it didn't have any important functions in our current organism. So we'll look at vestigial structures. These are structures that are no longer seeming to have as much importance in the organism as they did in the ancestors. We'll also look at embryology. This is very fascinating. When you look at the embryos of every single organism, we can see similarities and differences. But in the very early stages, these images here are the very early stages, they are all extremely similar to each other. So here's an example for you. All vertebrate embryos have what are called pharyngeal pouches in their throat. So everything that has a backbone, a fish, a reptile, a bird, and humans, they're highlighted in blue right here. These are the pharyngeal pouches. And they develop into different things, but in the beginning stages, they are the same. In fish, they're going to develop into gills. And then in mammals, they're going to develop into pieces of your ear. So that's interesting that we can see the similarities at those very early stages. We also see that all life has DNA or RNA, and we can look at that genetic code and we can see similarities and differences in that genetic code. So for example, if we look at the human compared to the rhesus monkey or a mouse, we have about 8 different amino acid chains versus 27 different between us and the mouse. And so that helps us also determine how close recent ancestors are from different organisms by looking at the similarities in their DNA and RNA. And we'll do a little lab activity where we look at that as well. There is a video on Schoology I would like you to watch that focuses on how fossils are made. So if you would, please watch that. And keep in mind that natural selection is widely accepted, okay? The arguments are constantly changing because we are always finding new observations and new information, new fossils, new DNA evidence. But the key to remember is that evolution is descent with modification. We really don't, as scientists, dispute whether evolution happened or not, but what we really do dispute is the aspects about how evolution occurs, what may have triggered the change in frequency of a particular trait. And now that we can test DNA, we really look to see, is that a gradual change or can it happen very quickly and sporadically? All right, so that is your notes for today. You're going to go on Schoology, you're going to watch the videos that I've posted there for you, and then we will do some work with looking at all of these different pieces of evidence of evolution over the next 2 weeks.